At 4:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time this afternoon, just hours after Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney systematically proved that President Trump lied about the U.S.-Canada crisis during a globally televised fact-check watched by over 1.2 billion people, and as the United States Congress prepared to vote tomorrow morning on overriding Trump's second veto of implementation legislation, Carney invoked a provision of international trade law that has never been used in modern history. Legal experts believed this provision was essentially dormant. Carney formally notified the World Trade Organization that Canada is activating Article 21 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the security exception clause that allows any WTO member to suspend all trade obligations to another member if that member's actions pose a threat to the invoking nation's essential security interests. Under Article 21, Canada is declaring that the United States poses a threat to Canadian national security, and that Canada is therefore suspending all WTO obligations regarding trade with the United States. This means Canada is no longer bound by any international trade rules governing its economic relationship with America. Canada can impose unlimited tariffs on U.S. goods. Canada can ban imports from the United States entirely. Canada can nationalize U.S. corporate assets in Canada. Canada can refuse to honor U.S. intellectual property. Canada can do anything economically because the international legal framework that normally constrains such actions no longer applies to U.S.-Canada trade. Article 21 has been invoked only a handful of times in the 77-year history of GATT and the WTO, always in cases of literal warfare or imminent military conflict. Canada just invoked it against the United States, its closest ally, its largest trading partner, and a fellow democracy. This is Canada declaring that economic relations with the United States are now governed by the same legal framework that applies during wartime. Trump thought he could ignore congressional override legislation and continue making demands. Carney just activated a legal mechanism that gives Canada unlimited economic warfare authority, and there's nothing the United States can do to stop it. In this breakdown, I'm going to walk you through exactly what Article 21 allows Canada to do, and why this is the most powerful economic weapon in international trade law. I'm going to show you the immediate reaction from global trade institutions and why the WTO is supporting Canada's invocation. I'm going to reveal what happened in Washington when officials realized Canada can now legally do anything it wants economically without WTO constraints. I'm going to explain why Article 21 has never been invoked against a major trading partner before, and why Canada's use of it sets a precedent that could reshape global trade. And I'm going to give you 3 scenarios for what happens when Canada operates under unlimited economic warfare authority. Subscribe to join the community and share this video if it brought you value. Let me walk you through what Article 21 of GATT actually says, because understanding the text is critical to grasping how powerful this provision is. Article 21, titled Security Exceptions, states, "Nothing in this agreement shall be construed to prevent any contracting party from taking any action which it considers necessary for the protection of its essential security interests relating to fissionable materials, arms, ammunition, implements of war, or taken in time of war or other emergency in international relations." The key phrase is any action which it considers necessary for the protection of its essential security interests. Under Article 21, if a nation determines that its security is threatened, that nation can take any action without being constrained by WTO rules, and the determination of what constitutes a security threat is self-judging, meaning the invoking nation decides for itself whether the threat exists. Canada's formal notification to the WTO states, "Canada hereby invokes Article 21 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Canada has determined that the actions of the United States of America, including violations of bilateral trade agreements, threats to Canadian sovereignty and territorial integrity, economic coercion designed to force policy changes, suspension and threatened termination of defense cooperation agreements, and refusal to honor commitments made by the United States Congress, constitute a threat to Canada's essential security interests. Under Article 21, Canada is suspending all obligations under GATT and under WTO agreements with respect to trade with the United States effective immediately. Canada reserves the right to take any actions it deems necessary to protect Canadian security interests without constraint from international trade rules." What does this mean in practical terms? It means every WTO rule that normally governs trade between Canada and the United States no longer applies. The most favored nation principle, which requires treating all WTO members equally, doesn't apply. Canada can discriminate against U.S. goods while offering preferential treatment to other countries. The national treatment principle, which requires treating foreign goods the same as domestic goods, doesn't apply. Canada can favor Canadian products over American products in Canadian markets. Tariff bindings, which limit how high tariffs can go, don't apply. Canada can impose 100% tariffs, 500% tariffs, or infinite tariffs on any U.S. product. Prohibitions on quantitative restrictions don't apply. Canada can ban U.S. imports entirely if it chooses. Intellectual property protections don't apply. Canada can ignore U.S. patents, trademarks, and copyrights. Canadian companies can manufacture products using U.S. technology without paying licensing fees. Restrictions on subsidies don't apply. Canada can subsidize Canadian industries without limit to make them competitive against U.S. firms. Investment protections don't apply. Canada can nationalize U.S.-owned factories, real estate, and assets without compensation. Essentially, Article 21 invocation means Canada can conduct total economic warfare against the United States legally under international law. Subscribe right now because what I'm about to show you is the immediate global reaction and why major economies are supporting Canada's unprecedented use of Article 21. At 5:15 p.m., 28 minutes after Canada's notification, WTO Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala issued a statement. The statement said, "The WTO has received Canada's notification of Article 21 invocation regarding trade with the United States. Article 21 is a legitimate provision of GATT that recognizes nations have the sovereign right to protect their security. While Article 21 invocations are rare, Canada's notification meets the legal requirements. The WTO will not challenge Canada's determination that its security interests are threatened. Member states have the right to make that determination for themselves." That's the WTO explicitly endorsing Canada's position and declining to intervene. At 5:30 p.m., the European Union issued a statement. The EU supports Canada's invocation of Article 21. The United States' actions toward Canada, including violation of USMCA, threats to sovereignty, and refusal to honor congressional legislation, constitute behavior that justifies security exception claims. The EU will not challenge Canada's Article 21 invocation and will continue to support Canada's defense of its sovereignty. At 5:45 p.m., Japan issued a similar statement supporting Canada's legal position. At 6 p.m., the Democratic Trade Alliance Secretary announced that all 62 member nations have agreed to support Canada's Article 21 invocation, and that alliance members will coordinate to ensure Canada has access to any goods or services that Canada might previously have imported from the United States. If Canada bans U.S. imports, alliance members will fill the gap. At 6:15 p.m., China issued a statement. While carefully worded to avoid appearing to take sides in the U.S.-Canada dispute, China's statement noted that Article 21 exists precisely for situations where a nation faces security threats from a trading partner, and that China respects Canada's sovereign right to invoke available legal mechanisms. By 7 p.m., every major trading nation except the United States had issued statements either explicitly supporting Canada's Article 21 invocation or declining to challenge it. The global trade community has given Canada a green light to conduct unlimited economic warfare against the United States under color of international law. Here's what happened in Washington when Article 21 invocation reached officials. At 5:00 p.m., the U.S. Trade Representative was informed of Canada's notification to the WTO. According to sources, the Trade Representative immediately convened an emergency meeting with legal advisors to discuss whether the U.S. could challenge Canada's Article 21 invocation. Legal counsel reviewed the provision and concluded that Article 21 invocations are self-judging and essentially unchallengeable. The WTO dispute resolution system does not have authority to overrule a member's determination that its security is threatened. The U.S. has no legal recourse. At 5:30 p.m., the National Security Council held an emergency meeting. According to sources, officials discussed the implications of Canada operating without WTO constraints. The Treasury Department warned that if Canada imposes extreme tariffs or bans U.S. imports, American exporters will lose access to their second-largest market. The Commerce Department warned that if Canada ignores U.S. intellectual property, American companies could face billions in losses from unauthorized use of U.S. technology. The State Department warned that Canada's Article 21 invocation sets a precedent that other countries could follow. If the EU, Japan, or other allies invoke Article 21 against the U.S., citing similar security concerns, the entire rules-based trading system collapses for the United States. At 6:00 p.m., Trump was briefed. According to sources, Trump was told that Canada just invoked a provision that allows Canada to ignore all trade rules when dealing with the United States. Trump reportedly asked what the U.S. could do to stop it. Advisors explained that there's nothing the U.S. can do legally because Article 21 is a recognized provision of international trade law, and Canada's invocation is valid under that law. Trump reportedly said, "Then we'll invoke it too and we'll cut off all trade with Canada." Advisors reportedly explained that the U.S. needs Canadian imports, particularly energy, far more than Canada needs U.S. markets, now that Canada has redirected trade to the Democratic Trade Alliance. A U.S. invocation of Article 21 would hurt the U.S. more than Canada. At 6:30 p.m., the White House issued a statement. Canada's invocation of Article 21 is an abuse of a provision designed for actual security threats, like war or terrorism. Canada is not facing a security threat from the United States. This is a cynical legal maneuver designed to justify economic aggression. The United States will challenge this invocation at the WTO and will take all necessary measures to protect American interests. The statement threatens a challenge, but as legal experts immediately pointed out, Article 21 invocations are not subject to WTO dispute resolution. The U.S. has no avenue for challenge. At 7 p.m., Carney held a brief press conference to explain why Canada invoked Article 21. Carney said, "Article 21 exists because the drafters of GATT understood that sometimes international relations deteriorate to the point where normal trade rules cannot apply. When a nation faces threats to its sovereignty, when agreements are violated, when a trading partner becomes unreliable and coercive, the threatened nation must have the legal authority to protect itself without being constrained by rules designed for peaceful cooperative relationships. The United States violated USMCA. The United States threatened Canadian sovereignty. The United States ignored its own Congress. These actions constitute a threat to Canadian security. Article 21 gives Canada the legal authority to respond without constraint. I want to be clear about Canada's intentions. We do not plan to abuse this authority. We do not plan to impose extreme tariffs or to ban all U.S. imports. What we plan to do is ensure that Canada can never again be held hostage by U.S. economic pressure. If the United States properly implements the 5 requirements that Congress mandated, if the U.S. demonstrates sustained reliability over time, Canada will consider voluntarily reinstating WTO obligations with respect to U.S. trade. But that reinstatement will be conditional on American behavior. The United States no longer has the automatic right to trade with Canada under international rules. The United States must earn that right through actions. At 7:30 p.m., Canada announced the first action taken under Article 21 authority. The Canadian government issued an order requiring all U.S. companies operating in Canada to register with the Canadian government within 30 days and to provide detailed information about their operations, ownership, financial flows, and connections to the U.S. government. Companies that fail to register will have their Canadian assets frozen and their operations suspended. This registration requirement, which would normally violate WTO rules on non-discrimination, is legal under Article 21. Canada is establishing a monitoring system for American economic activity in Canada that can be used to identify and neutralize any future U.S. pressure attempts. At 18:00 p.m., Canada announced a second action. The Canadian government is establishing a Strategic Industries Protection Board with authority to review any proposed sale, transfer, or licensing of Canadian technology resources or intellectual property to U.S. entities. The board can block transactions that it determines could give the United States leverage over Canada. This means Canadian companies cannot sell strategic assets to American buyers without government approval. Again, this would normally violate WTO non-discrimination rules, but Article 21 makes it legal. At 8:30 p.m., Democratic Trade Alliance members announced coordinated actions in support of Canada's Article 21 invocation. 12 alliance members, including the UK, France, Germany, and Japan, announced they are implementing their own restrictions on U.S. trade, citing solidarity with Canada's security concerns. These restrictions include enhanced scrutiny of U.S. investments, requirements for U.S. companies to report ownership and operations, and review processes for technology transfers to U.S. entities. The restrictions fall short of full Article 21 invocations, but they signal that if the U.S. continues its current course, other major economies might invoke Article 21 themselves. At 9:00 p.m., multiple news outlets reported that legal scholars who specialize in international trade law are describing Canada's Article 21 invocation as the most significant development in trade law since the WTO was founded in 1995. According to experts, if Canada's invocation stands unchallenged, which appears certain, It establishes that major democracies can use Article 21 not just for military conflicts, but for economic security threats, including violations of agreements and coercive behavior by trading partners. This expands the scope of Article 21 dramatically and creates a precedent that could be used by other nations facing U.S. pressure. At 9:30 p.m., congressional leaders were asked about Article 21. Senate Majority Leader Schumer said, "Canada's Article 21 invocation is a direct result of President Trump's refusal to honor agreements and to implement what Congress mandated. Tomorrow, Congress will override President Trump's veto for the second time. If President Trump continues to refuse implementation, Canada will be legally justified in taking increasingly severe economic actions against the United States, and we will have no grounds to complain because we brought this on ourselves." Let me explain why Article 21 has never been invoked against a major trading partner before, and why Canada's use sets a dangerous precedent for the United States. Historically, Article 21 has been invoked in cases of actual warfare, India-Pakistan conflicts, imminent security threats, Russia-Ukraine after 2014, or isolated disputes over arms and military technology. It has never been invoked by one major democracy against another major democracy in peacetime over economic policy disputes. The reason is that Article 21 is essentially a nuclear option. Once invoked, the entire trade relationship operates outside international law. This creates uncertainty, reduces trade, and damages both economies. Countries have avoided using Article 21 against major partners because the damage is mutual and because it breaks down the rules-based system that benefits everyone. Canada is invoking it now because Carney has concluded that the damage of remaining within the rules-based system, while the U.S. violates those rules, is greater than the damage of operating outside that system. This is a calculation based on Trump's behavior having made the rules-based system non-functional for Canada. The precedent this sets is that other countries could make similar calculations. If the EU decides that U.S. behavior threatens European security, the EU could invoke Article 21. If Japan makes that determination, Japan could invoke it. If enough countries invoke Article 21 against the U.S., America effectively gets expelled from the global trading system, not formally, but functionally. Let me give you 3 scenarios for the Article 21 era. Scenario 1. Rapid American compliance prevents escalation. Congress overrides Trump tomorrow. Trump finally implements properly under threat of cabinet invoking 25th Amendment. By Friday, actual implementation occurs. Canada suspends Article 21 invocation and reinstates WTO obligations. Article 21 remains on the books as a Canadian option if U.S. reliability falters again. The precedent has been set but not fully activated. Scenario 2. Limited Article 21 use becomes permanent. Trump refuses implementation. Canada uses Article 21 authority to impose targeted restrictions on U.S. economic activity in Canada, but stops short of full economic warfare. Over months, the restrictions become normalized. U.S.-Canada trade continues, but under a framework where Canada has unilateral authority to impose conditions and restrictions. The relationship is permanently asymmetric, with Canada holding legal authority over economic terms. Scenario 3, Article 21 Cascade. Canada's invocation inspires other nations. Within 6 months, the EU invokes Article 21, citing U.S. unreliability. Japan follows, South Korea follows. Within a year, the United States is subject to Article 21 invocations from 40-plus countries representing 60% of global trade. The U.S. effectively operates outside the WTO system, not because the U.S. withdrew, but because everyone else invoked security exceptions against America. U.S. trade collapses, the economy contracts, and America becomes an isolated power. I'm watching tomorrow's congressional override vote, whether any additional countries invoke Article 21 or implement Article 21-like restrictions, and whether Canada announces additional actions under Article 21 authority. Carney triggered Article 21. Canada can now legally do anything economically without WTO constraints. Trump is stunned. The world is watching. And the rules-based trading system just excluded the United States. Tomorrow, Congress overrides again, but Article 21 is activated, and that changes everything.